Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Lauren Speranza, Director of the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, here in Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to welcome everyone to today's event on boosting transatlantic cooperation on defense technology. There's so much momentum building around this topic, both in Washington and Europe these days, and we're very thankful to our colleagues at the British Embassy in Washington for working with us on today's event, as well as our partners at NATO's Public Diplomacy Division for supporting CEPA's work on emerging tech and the alliance. Well, this last week of summits during President Joe Biden's first trip to Europe brought a lot of welcome developments on transatlantic tech policy, from the creation of a new Defense Innovation Accelerator and a NATO Innovation Fund at the NATO Summit, to the US and UK's new Atlantic Charter on the eve of the G7, which included a landmark technology pact, to the creation of a new Tech and Trade Council emerging from the US-EU Summit. It's wonderful to see these acknowledgements acknowledging not only the national security implications of emerging and disruptive technologies, but really the transatlantic security implications. And this is exactly what CEPA's Defense Tech Initiative was created to support, and why we're hosting conversations such as this one. And I'm very proud to see that work expanding every day as interest in these critical issues continues to grow. But behind all of these multinational initiatives and institutional efforts at NATO proper, there are also several national developments ongoing in key allies, which will certainly have an impact on transatlantic security. In addition to some of the efforts ongoing in France and Germany, which we've highlighted at previous events, the UK has really been driving a lot of transformation in this space, including through its integrated review and defense command paper released earlier this year, which elevated tech as a core policy priority, and also the digital defense strategy, which recently came out. Now, the US as well has been busy developing its national AI strategy alongside the new administration's defense budget and global force posture review. And so all of these things together will have an enormous impact on what the alliance does going forward on defense tech. So as we come out of the summit week, today we'll discuss where is NATO's science and tech agenda heading, how does it align with national defense tech efforts that are already underway, and where are there gaps to strengthen transatlantic cooperation and really make good on all of the commitments that were made last week going forward. I'm very grateful to our fantastic speakers today from the US Department of Defense, the UK Ministry of Defense, NATO, and even our CEPA bench, and to the fantastic Deborah Hayes of Sky News, who will lead our discussion today and properly introduce our speakers. I know it'll be a terrific discussion, and if you enjoyed today's conversation, please check out CEPA's defense tech work on our website at cepa.org, where the exchanges will continue. And with that, thank you all for being here, and Deb, over to you.
Thank you very much, and I apologise in advance for the background noise. As you can see, I'm on a street in London, keeping it real. So just first of all, a massive thank you to our speakers today. And I'm going to just introduce everybody and then kind of open up to a general question to get everyone sort of giving their thoughts on this subject. So first of all, from here in the UK, the Ministry of Defence, Nicholas Joad, who is the Director of Defence Science and Technology and the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor at the Ministry of Defence. Across the pond, we have Barbara McQuiston, who is Acting Under Secretary of Defence for Research and Engineering at the Department of Defence. And then, very important, another Brit I see, Brian Wells, who is the Chief Scientist at NATO. And last but not least, we have Nicholas Nelson, who is Senior Fellow for Emerging Tech and Policy, the Defence Tech Initiative at CEPA. So thank you ever so much, everybody, for being here. I thought to sort of open up the discussion, I'd love to hear from all of you, like, why is boosting transatlantic cooperation on defence technology, why is that important? Why should people care? And if we could start in the order that I listed your names, if that's okay. So Nick, if you would like to speak first.
So first of all, thank you very much for coming the opportunity to talk. I think, why do we do collaboration? I mean, we do collaboration for an awful lot of reasons. One is it boosts our ability to collectively develop technology, but also, more importantly, in many ways, it actually challenges to make sure that we've got a well-formed view of the future and where things are going. So there are a number of reasons why we actually do collaboration. And just picking up on both my NATO and US colleagues, we actually have quite a lot of collaboration with them along both of those lines. So, what you will find is that we go after problems collectively that we couldn't do on our own. We actually think about the future together, and we do quite a lot of soul searching about whether we've got the alignment right and the processes right and all of those sorts of really great things. So that's really why we need to do all of that. In particular in the UK has just gone through the integrated review. And one of the key planks of that was how important science and technology is, both to the UK nationally and also within the context of our international partners and collaborations. There's a whole reasons why we think that, which I'm sure we'll come on to a little bit later. And then if I could maybe just pick up slightly on the conversation about how do we make sure that we are going in the same direction. The UK has just published a defence technology framework. The US has similar sets of priorities. And so does NATO. And interestingly, I would encourage people to dig under some of those published documents, and you will find an enormous degree of commonality. That's actually not very surprising because there's lots of colleagues on this call that I deal with quite regularly, actually, and that's something that we collectively have worried about in the past. So that's why we do collaboration. Lots of reasons.
And Barbara, what do you think? And can you also give a sense as well of why it's important?
Well, I believe collaboration, especially with our allies and across the board, is critical. We're looking at the development of science and technology and disruptive technologies and what it means not only for our future in national security, but economic security as well. And so being able to move forward together to promote and leverage both the commercial sector as well as the defense and science sector within our countries is going to be critical as we go forward to look at shared democratic values and trust, and also being able to ensure defense against things that might be disruptive to us all. So I think it's important that we work together.
And Brian, do you want to come in and offer a NATO perspective?
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'll pick up some points that have already been mentioned, but give a NATO perspective on this. Of course, international collaboration allows like-minded countries, allies, NATO allies, but also NATO partners that are not allies to share a common problem, to share the costs of research, to pool their experience. And that allows transatlantic cooperation, but it also allows, given NATO's global network of scientists, it allows scientists, for example, from the Asia-Pacific Rim as well, to work under a NATO umbrella. So at any one time, the NATO Science and Technology Organization has about 6,000 scientists working on NATO projects. A lot of them are based in the US and also Canada, and others are based in the European allies, but also the partner nations of NATO as well, partners such as Australia and Japan. So we are able to bring all that expertise together, and it is quite often the expertise of the individual scientists that allows NATO to keep its technological edge. We must remember that 18 of the top 20 universities in the world are on the soil of NATO allies. And so it is this intellectual edge that allows NATO to maintain the technological edge, I believe, going forward. So this is absolutely vital for NATO. One other point I would raise, my final point in terms of the importance of international scientific cooperation, is that it lies at the bedrock, the foundation of allied military interoperability. If the scientists work together on a common defense science problem, and that is then matured by the nations ultimately into fielded military capability, then you are hardwiring interoperability right from the start. And that again is absolutely vital to NATO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, do you want to give your views sort of at the looking in at this? You've heard how the panelists think it's very important and what they are doing to collaborate. Do you think they're doing enough? Do you think it's going well? Do you think they're missing an opportunity?
No, thank you, Deborah. I think all of what the panelists said is obviously quite true. And as we're shifting into this era of great power competition from what I would kind of refer to as NATO's and especially the US's 2-decade-long strategic pause for the global war on terror, alliances are going to be more important than ever with two, call them what you will, adversaries or challenging nations on a great power standpoint. But additionally, and one thing to your question specifically, I don't believe we're doing enough right now. There is, in this era of great power competition with stagnating defense budgets, interoperability, we say a lot of the right things. We have, the CJAD, C2 concepts out there. But with that said, not enough has been done in that regard. And to Brian's point, yes, there's a lot of great R&D being done across various organizations, national, NATO, the FRDCs and UARCs, and this is all fantastic. But at the same time, defense is no longer driving R&D priorities, and that's just a fact. If you go back to 1990 globally, they were roughly on par, commercial to defense driving priorities. As of 2015, commercial was 3.5x that of defense R&D. It's now estimated to be over 5. And what that means is, and this is actually a good point that Barbara brought up, we all have to do a better job of engaging the commercial sector, particularly in my view, the more non-traditional side. So the venture capital backed or venture backed startups, be it Series A, Series B, C, et cetera, as well as other non-traditionals who are really working on interesting dual use tech that could be used in the ecosystem. And one final point is there's still a delineation in many discussions I have, be it at DoD, with the UK MOD and other agencies and organizations across the alliance, where people still draw this hard line between this is defense tech, this is dual use tech, this is commercial, and those lines fundamentally don't exist. And those discussions are happening, but right now we really need to be more focused on how do we work together, but also enhance our return on investment. I know it can sometimes be a dirty phrase in defense communities, but how can we make sure that we're not duplicating across the alliance to the extent we are now? And to Brian's point, really integrating interoperability. We say we do that in the United States. We have all these great concepts with CJAD, C2, Joint All-Domain Operations. We still, in the US, have platforms in individual services that can't communicate, let alone cross services, let alone with our allies. And recent exercises have borne that out, particularly on the international side. So I think these are all great steps that we're taking, but there's a lot of work left to do, particularly as we look at in my view, an existential threat that we have not really faced since the end of the Cold War.
Thank you. Very, very interesting observations there and challenges. And kind of like sort of getting to that point of how I guess it's all about working together and sort of being aligned in priorities when it comes to defense technology if you are sort of collaborating. I'd be interested to hear what you all think about how aligned the allies are, the NATO allies are on their defense technology priorities. And like, for example, the UK has got a list of critical, emerging and disruptive technologies. So too the US and NATO's Science and Technology Organization. Can you just give a sense of to what extent is there consensus or convergence among these lists? And how does that affect transatlantic cooperation? And I don't know who would like to go first, but I do know that Barbara, your time is precious, more precious than the others because you've got a time limit. So maybe you'd like to take that one first.
Yeah, I'm happy and thank you for allowing me to do this. I would say emerging and disruptive technologies and the NATO's list is consistent with US DoD modernization priorities. And the United States supports a great amount of research and development in emerging technology. We have DARPA that is essentially launching new frontiers in science and technology, but really a lot of the alignment and the priorities are very clear in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, autonomy, cyber, quantum science, hypersonics, and space. And I think embracing these technologies and shared democratic values and free inquiry and competition and trust will help us improve our competitive edge. Again, sort of looking at commercial enterprise and modernization within our services. defense services is going to be critical. So the implementation strategy and NATO strategies going forward are going to need a lot of cooperation between research and engineering's principals, directors, and NATO's, and working with the UK to make sure that we can all work and leverage this work and our commercial capabilities as well. So we have to work in tandem to make this happen.
And Brian, can you just give your thoughts from a NATO perspective? Obviously, you've just had that big summit and the communique, and obviously science and technology featured strongly in there. Are you happy that there's sort of consensus on the priorities, or are you worried that there's that you're missing a trick here?
Thank you for that question. I very much agree with what Barbara has just said. The NATO Science and Technology Strategy was approved by the North Atlantic Council, by the ambassadors of the nations, drilling down into detail. NATO's work on emerging and disruptive technologies was approved at high level by defense ministers in 2019. So again, the national defense ministers approved the focus on the particular emerging and disruptive technologies. There will be differences of detail, of course, between nations, because different nations see their defense in slightly different ways, and that is perfectly right and proper and understandable. But at the top level, there is this strong convergence on the priorities. I'd also like to pick up the broader political point of shared values. When the NATO Secretary General launched his political NATO 2030 initiative just over a year ago now, he made quite clear that in maintaining the technological edge, NATO would preserve the norms and values of the allied nations. That is very strongly embedded in our own thinking and NATO's own approach to new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Nick, could you give us, from the UK perspective, obviously, again, science and technology is just weaved through the integrated review, this idea of the UK wanting to be a science and technology superpower. And obviously we've got this, as people call it, the Dominic Cummings DARPA coming online. Are you satisfied that that the UK is able to, it agrees with its allies on what's on the priorities and is making the most of working together at a time of competition when our rivals are working just as quickly against us?
I think maybe if I could pick it up, there's always more we can do, undoubtedly, and I think that's a matter of priorities at the time and resourcing and those sorts of things. But if I look at all the documents and the stated positions that both NATO and our US colleagues have actually published, there is a remarkable degree of similarity. Now you will find that sometimes it's worth digging under the bonnet, as we would say in the UK, a little bit, because nations actually use slightly different language for things. And we certainly, both with NATO and our US colleagues, have actually done an assessment of our alignment, and it's very good. So I'm very comfortable that actually, certainly at the top level, we've got really good alignment. We probably have very good alignment also. So that's almost in terms of the opportunity space. I think we've got very good alignment about what we think the world might look like and the threats that we face as well. So actually, I think we've got a really good basis for doing that collaboration. Just picking up on some of my colleagues' points about are we doing enough collaboration with across all the non-traditional suppliers and all of those sorts of things? The answer is probably not. But if you look in all three organisations, or two nations of organisations, they are actually all on that journey. And much of the conversation I have with my colleagues across government in the UK is about how we can exploit civil technology. And actually, I have very similar conversations with my US counterparts and also with Brian in NATO. So I think we've got a pretty good foundation, but actually we face a lot of challenges, would be my summing up of that.
And what do you think, Nicholas? Do you think everyone seems very harmonious here and as if they all agree on priorities. Do you think that they're right, or do you see actually in reality that different nations do put more focus on different things, which actually isn't helpful?
No, I think it's a great question. And to your point, I think it's right for nations to disagree because the priorities of, say, the Baltics are going very wildly from that of the UK, France, or the United States, both from a strategic standpoint and the challenges they face, but also from a technical standpoint, they're going to be different. Everything from weapon systems to cyber tools, they're going to be more interested in. But that leads me to, I guess, one area where I would somewhat disagree is around EDTs or emerging disruptive tech writ large. We all agree on priorities, but there's still a tendency across strategic documents, be it the National Defense Strategy in the United States or some of the NATO priorities that come out, to view a lot of these capabilities in an individual vacuum. My personal view is that these capabilities, yes, can be game-changing individually, but it's really when you start putting them together and you get the force multiplying effects that they are truly game-changing. So what exactly do I mean by that? I'll give just one quick example. If you look at how we look at autonomous systems and unmanned vehicles, be it unmanned aerial systems all the way down to UUVs or unmanned underwater vessels, how are you going to basically link them all? And how are you going to encourage this autonomy suite, which is going to enable the swarming that we're looking at now? Well, right now our current infrastructure does not really allow for to take it to its logical conclusion, and that's where the rollout of a 5G bubble is going to be critical. Well, right now you have roughly 12 different nations in NATO, all doing different things on the 5G front. We talk about as if there's going to be a giant 5G bubble. Well, if you truly are looking at all of these EDTs as interlocking systems, we really need to be looking at this on a systems approach. Not, okay, well, we can do this autonomous thing now, we'll just develop 5G. And he's like, well, if we're all doing different things, particularly in the European theater, when it comes to 5G, as well as some concerns of external penetration from adversary states, how can we really imagine this future of war if these systems are already compromised and this bubble, in fact, does not end up existing or is fundamentally penetrated? So that would be my other concern. And I guess the final piece of that is really when we talk about these different areas, and this is perhaps the less likely outcome, but what I really love to see is us trying to take the Estonia example as a case study. So Estonia obviously suffered some very rough cyber attacks, to say the least, starting in 2008, and it's been exacerbated. But they've really developed best-in-class, on par with pretty much any nation in the world, cyber basically capabilities, both in a tool set as well as the skill sets of their defense folks and the commercial sector. And that just shows the power of specialization. And if we really are dedicated to the alliance and do have that foundational trust and are focused on getting ROI, I think the future of NATO as an alliance is for medium and smaller states to start specializing and deconflict that with the larger states who can then allow them to develop those capabilities while they focus on perhaps some of the more high CapEx areas. And while that may be a bit of a pipe dream in terms of national priorities, if we're taking this to hey, we are looking at potential conflict on two fronts, that's what's going to need to happen in my view.
I'd like to amplify that as well in his comments, and that is, I believe that we can learn a lot from each other. And we all have different experiences, as you were mentioning, but we also have different core competencies. But looking at best in practice and being able to handle a lot of the security threats that we have going forward, to me, is going to be important, not just for national security, but for economic security as well, because I think it translates across the board as to how we're working together at large and even within the global economy. So I think we need to be sharing our information and our knowledge and our experiences so that we can quickly innovate and adopt new practices for security for all of our allies.
Thank you. And can you just give a sense, Barbara, like looking at the sort of the priorities, the technology priorities of allies, like how do they differ, or do they differ from those of China and Russia? And in your mind, are there certain areas where you are worried that we are falling behind? I know that NATO and the UK and the US talks about, the sort of having cutting edge technology, which obviously we always have for decades, but that can't be assumed, can it, going forward? Like, what areas of concern are there for you where you think we are losing our edge?
Well, I think maintaining our leadership position overall is going to be critical, but also looking at the new technologies within sort of our own value system is going to be critical, especially when I look at AI and other sort of adaptations of technology in different areas in security, that I think we can have a differing and a competitive model there that would differentiate ourselves from potential adversaries and competitors. I also look at the fact that we can't sort of rely on the fact that we've had leadership in certain areas. When we look at microelectronics and other areas, I think that we have to be concerned about our position going forward, and more importantly, concerned about how we're investing in the future. We're always sort of feeling, when we look at secure supply chains and other points of vulnerabilities, that we're addressing it by looking at how we can invest in our own science and technology and move forward. But we want to make sure that we're investing in areas for the future, and how we can shape that and support our countries together. So I think there's a lot to address there as we move forward.
And could you also just say, is it a worry for the US when obviously for militaries to be effective in this kind of digital information driven world, you can see like the US military, you see the UK military, they're adapting to be able to make maximum effect of technology, but surely that's going to be a divisive factor for the militaries within NATO, for example, that haven't adapted, that interoperability, that sort of buzzword, becomes impossible. Is that a worry for you if other militaries don't invest in the transformation that's required to adapt to future and emerging technologies?
The investment structure is always critical when we look at how we are being able to secure our electronics, how we are communicating. That's going to be critical because of our infrastructure dependency. So I think this is a challenge for us going forward. And we also have different things challenging our infrastructure, not just our adversaries, but nature and other things along those lines. So resiliency within our systems is going to be important as we move forward. So it's not an easy solution, but I think we need to be out in front of it. And unfortunately, we're going to have to all make certain investments and help each other with it.
And I'm just going to keep sticking with you because I know that you're going to have to leave quite soon. So I hope that's okay with everybody. But could you just tell us, what does the recently released Defence Budget 2022 tell us about US plans for defence technology going forward? Like, are there any major new initiatives that you expect to take shape in the coming months that you are able to talk to us about?
Well, as you probably imagine, we're putting together the strategy and how we want to move forward. Although I can say the priority is on science and technology and emphasizing innovation in everything that we're doing right now. So we are looking at being able to field and demonstrate technology to work closer with more of a commercial model and sort of be able to embrace faster and more effective transition of technology into the services. But I would definitely say emphasis on science and technology.
In the NATO, well, the NATO communique from the summit, there was this talk about this transatlantic defense accelerator, or this some kind of technology hub between the US and sort of the alliance, kind of maybe like a sort of DARPA equivalent. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you envisage that? Is that something that's going to be an amplifier of what the US does? Obviously, there are different security kind of clearances, I imagine, or ability to share the kind of knowledge that you have, or are there potential drawbacks to this idea?
I'm very optimistic and enthusiastic because I think through these alliance and partnerships, we can work more with startup companies in industry and universities and promote transatlantic cooperation, and hopefully be able to address some of the gaps in technological sides amongst the allies. That could be, I think, one big supportive step moving forward. And basically be able to work together to come to solutions that we wouldn't be able to apart. So I'm excited that we're doing this and enhancing our transatlantic security, because it underpins everything that we do. And we want to really seek complementary interoperability cooperation with our allies. So so I think this is a great step in the right direction.
And can you just respond to Nicholas's point that he made in the opening about how you know, going forward, increasingly it's not the governments that are coming up with this cutting edge technology, it is the private sector. And you know, are you worried that there's too much? Obviously, there's a lot of caution and a desire to avoid risk when you're dealing with contracts, and the big defense industries do have you know, a large proportion of contracts when dealing with like DoD or with the UK Ministry of Defence. Are you worried though that you know, that could be mean that allies are left behind because they're not able to be quick enough to adapt to the new and emerging technologies that are coming out, and what's being done to ensure that that the private sector and innovation in the private sector is increasingly being embraced and used and exploited?
Well, I can say this, and that is that, you know, oftentimes you get agencies like DARPA, they not only create new frontiers of science and technology, but there's additional investments that help de-risk the technology and the new innovation that then attracts private capital. And it goes in all sorts of directions. I can tell you that from my experience at DARPA. You know, you start with an idea or embrace a really hard security problem and you invest in technologies. We were worried, you know, my classic example right now, we were worried 10 years ago or so about epidemics and pandemics, and we were looking at the nature of vaccine technology. We made some really fundamental investments across the board that obviously with mRNA technology have been critical in facing the challenges we have now. If we hadn't invested and sort of de-risked a lot of the technology around vaccines, we would not have had the solutions that we could have fallen back on for today. And I know that we have to do more to help nations across the board in this area, but to have the solutions and the technology that can address it first, and the public-private investment structures makes that possible. So,
and hey, Deborah, I kind of just jump in with one thing. I want to build what Barbara had said. So that is one of the things that we're seeing across Alliance members, this idea that holding DARPA up as kind of the shining example. So we'd like to recreate it. The reason DARPA is so successful, and Barbara knows this definitely better than I do, is because it is rather unique out there. What I mean by that is it has a long tradition of being willing to fail. There are a number of great, you know, programs that just didn't get there, and that was okay. But the reason they were able to build this kind of unique culture is really three factors. They existed outside traditional bureaucracies, first of all, where they have folks in for what I would closely term almost tours of duties, and you went back out afterwards to either parts of the government or either commercial sector. So these were folks almost, I hate to use it because it's a belabored example, but almost a corporate venture capital or venture capital model where the actual core DARPA staff numbers around 100. And please correct me if I'm a little off there, Barbara. But a lot of this goes out to both tech companies, you know, your bigger aerospace and defense companies as well, and universities to solve these. And beyond existing outside of those traditional structures and having that ability to fail, DARPA also had the right authorities. And what I mean by that is it has a clear transition partner. So once things get to a certain level of TRL or technology readiness level, they can get transitioned to production opportunities within DoD. At the same time, DARPA does have that direct reporting ability up to the most senior levels of DoD, rather than having been stuck in the entrenched bureaucracy for good or for ill. And beyond that, they also have had, and obviously this year is even better for them, but they've had a clear and consistent budget. A lot of these really great innovation initiatives across a number of different countries, including our own, suffer from a great idea that either gets defunded or gets their funding cut in half after a year or two, or never gets their funding in the first place. And we're rife with that in the United States alone. So really, they have that clear, consistent budget. And the final thing gets back to my first point, really, is the talent. It is that differentiated talent out there that is not really replicated across the rest of DoD, the intelligence community, or elsewhere, where it's folks who do have this cross-pollination of experience and who are attracted to DARPA, even with, for instance, the pay cuts, that kind of thing, because they want to work on this really cutting edge, mission-driven focus. And if you're lacking anything across the talent, the budget, or the authorities, then it's going to fail.
I'm going to have to pop off, but thank you so much for this opportunity. And I look forward to having more opportunities like this with you in the future.
So I thought maybe if we can go to get a sort of a UK perspective on defence tech, which, you know, as we've just mentioned, was very much highlighted in the integrated review as a crucial way to boost the UK's power and security. Could you just give a sense of how that's actually going to be translated into reality? Like what Nicholas was just saying there about the, you know, the way that DARPA has been so successful was that willingness to fail. And you do hear ministers talking about how there is that desire to take risk. But if you look back at in the recent past, you know, in the last 10 years, this idea of innovation has always been curbed by the lack of funding and the requirement for funds to be spent elsewhere. Could you just give a sense of how the UK really is going to put, you know, take risk and put its money where its mouth is when it comes to grasping the opportunity of technology in defence going forwards, Nick?
So there's a whole variety of things that we do in the UK, some of which are structural and some initiatives. Maybe if I could just share with you a personal experience, because maybe I'm an unusual civil servant. I actually managed to get written into my terms of reference that if I didn't generate enough failures out of my portfolio, I was a failure. And that was all about, at the time, about having the right risk profile. So I think we have gone after some of those things that you've talked about before. If I could maybe just pick up one point, because I think we've talked quite a lot about, you know, technology and, you know, how much of that's going to come out of the commercial sector. I think one of the really rather brutal areas of competition that we face with some of our adversaries is the speed to which we generate military capabilities. So actually, it's not just about, you know, who can get access to the technologies. There are some technologies that actually it is all about that. Don't get me wrong, and we can talk about what those might be. But as you say, half of the R&D effort, if not more, that we would access comes from the civil sector. So actually the key skill we are looking at doing is actually an ability to pull through. It's about doing really rather smart system engineering to pull systems together to do that. And it's about having the right sort of ecosystem. So let's come on to some specific things we've done in the UK. We have an innovation program in the UK. We have something called DASA, which does some of those things that you say about, you know, try stuff, get some unconventional suppliers in, non-conventional suppliers in, fail early, you know, if that's what you need to do, or identify what you've got to do. So in a sense, there are a set of things that we have kicked off in the past probably 3 years. So, you know, we're seeing some impact there, but, you know, it's not the end state by all means. So I think there are some of those things, you know, happening in terms of pulling in the civil sector. There's quite a lot of that stuff in there about accessing more non-traditional suppliers, and there are some things in there about you know, how you incentivize your portfolios of research actually. So we do some of those things. Do we always get them right? No, we don't. You know, the UK is looking at setting up a DARPA-like entity, which is relatively early days for that. You know, there's legislation and things being passed to try and go after some of those things. But it's probably worth saying that it's at quite a different scale from DARPA. So, you know, you have to actually position it in the right space about what you're actually going to do with it. So, you know, and get the level of ambition right. And the level of expectation right. So there's a whole raft of things that, you know, we are sort of doing in that space, and there's a significant uplift in you know, R&D spending in defence in the UK. Certainly, it's probably at the healthiest I've seen it. I'm afraid I'm getting to that age where I can say things like in the last 30 years and actually mean it. You know, it is actually quite a healthy uplift in that sort of space, and actually.
Sorry, are you seeing the cultural change that's needed though? Because there's still so much money within the defence budget is invested into those long lead, long-term items, those big ticket items, heavy metal objects, rather than the new innovative technology that's more high risk. Like, are you seeing that change in culture that's needed to realise the ambition of the integrated review?
So the whole thesis of the integrated review was about actually having a balanced pipeline of activities going forward, and that's all. The very long-term low TRL stuff. That's where some of your emerging and disruptive techs can come from. There's also stuff in the middle that is all about, frankly, that competition over pace. So how quickly do you pull that through? And then there is some of the the traditional stuff that is maybe sort of metal bending and cutting and doing all those things. So the whole of the integrated review and MOD's response to it was about getting that balance right and changing some of those things. There's a big emphasis in the MOD about digital and information and how we enable that and how we do that. So I think there is a change. These things do take a while. I'm a realist. They take a while to sort of come through. But I can point to quite a lot of innovative stuff that's being put in the hands of users. If that's what we need to do quickly. And it's also actually, I think it's worth being a little bit balanced about some things take a very long time to bring into service, and they probably always will. The trick is to actually have your capability upgrade paths in such a way that you can compete on that introduction of new capabilities. Your platforms are going to be around a long time though, probably. Does that help?
And yes, no, thank you. That's interesting. And Brian, can I sort of bring you in here, just to sort of picking up on that? Again, I'm sorry to keep drawing back to the NATO summit but that communique was, a really strong piece of work, which we maybe hadn't seen from the alliance over the previous 4 years even. Could you just put some sort of meat on the bones of what this whole kind of transatlantic defence accelerator actually is going to be and achieve? What's the structure going to be like, its mandate, and how is it going to fit in with other NATO innovation initiatives? And if you could sort of elaborate it so for people who maybe aren't experts in this area could also understand.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll just start by underpinning what you've just said about how much science permeates through the summit communique that was issued last Monday. There's really 3 areas in that communique where science features. The first is the political agenda that the Secretary General launched last year, NATO 2030, which includes the Defence Innovation Accelerator, which I'll come back to, but also a much broader political agenda of where, subject to allies' agreement, NATO sees itself positioned politically in the future. The second area is understandably within innovation and emerging and disruptive technologies. And the third area is climate change, where NATO has launched an ambitious action plan on climate change. And the Secretary General is, of course, a former UN Special Envoy in climate change. So there is a lot of interest there. Looking now at the Defence Innovation Accelerator, this communique was clear that allies will launch a civil military defence innovation accelerator for the North Atlantic. And this was said in the context of fostering technological collaboration amongst the allies to promote interoperability, which we've already talked about, and encourage the development and adoption of new technological solutions to military needs. And this is very much NATO looking at what a lot of allies have already done. Nick has mentioned DASA, we've mentioned DARPA and other US entities that do this. And NATO is looking to be part of this innovation ecosystem in the way that adds value to what allies are already doing. So there's a lot of work still to be done. The communique has said that allies will launch this, but there still needs to be discussions amongst the nations on what precisely that form will take. So the political push has been made. There are details now to be worked through with the allies on how a NATO defence accelerator for the North Atlantic will add value to the broader ecosystem of what the nations are already doing with these accelerators. So thank you.
Doesn't there need to be a greater sense of urgency, given what competitors like China are doing and are able to do in terms of their rapid pace of innovation and ability to review and change and adapt? The fact that it's taken a long time for NATO to come up and decide that we're going to do this accelerator, and now just the decision itself is kind of a momentous moment without actually changing anything. Are you worried that there isn't enough urgency among allies to change and adapt and innovate?
There's certainly a sense of urgency within NATO and within the NATO allies. Bringing up something that Nick has already mentioned, the science and technology is one part of this innovation ecosystem. The science needs to be translated rapidly into fieldable military capability. And that is the difficult part, as it were, of innovation. And NATO is looking very carefully at where it can add value to the nations in this part of the maturation of the science into fieldable military capability. Although quite a lot of science is done under the NATO umbrella, the overwhelming majority of military capability is actually owned by the allies rather than by NATO. So the science is done within a NATO umbrella, but the exploitation and maturation into military capability will be for the allies, possibly by themselves or in other bilateral or multilateral agreements. Where NATO can help is, for example, in test and evaluation, which the Science and Technology Organization does do, as does Allied Command Transformation based at Norfolk, Virginia. Exercises are also something that NATO can do to mature the technologies and de-risk that very difficult valley of death, as we call it, between the science and the fielded military capability. So yes, there is a sense of urgency, and NATO is working through where it adds value to the nations in this innovation ecosystem.
Thank you for that. And how worried are you then that, I mean, already different NATO individual allies, like you say, you know, they already have different capabilities, but as technology becomes so much more important for militaries to be able to fight and conduct operations, that there's just going to be an even greater divide between the allies that can and those that can't, and actually the ones that don't transform and adapt and innovate are just going to be almost like a burden perhaps on the rest that can. I mean, America is already way ahead of everybody else, and you know, the UK sometimes can't speak to their American allies on the battlefield because of the differing tech that they use. Like, how worried are you about that widening gap?
Allies have always had different individual military capabilities, and they will continue to do so. The key here is interoperability. Provided the platforms can communicate to each other in a way that provides for militarily effective interoperations, then NATO can operate as an integrated alliance. And NATO does a huge amount of standardization in things like communications. For example, the standardization agreements that NATO runs, they're known as STANAGs colloquially, cover a very, very broad range of agreements amongst the allies, particularly in the area of communications. So we've got satellite communications, standardization agreements there, underwater acoustic communication. NATO's own laboratory at La Spezia was instrumental in driving that particular standardization agreement. And I think one of the things that we might lose sight of when we talk about emerging and disruptive capabilities is, yes, they may cause some divergence in capabilities owned by the individual allies, but we can flip that coin round and say that emerging and disruptive technologies can and will help interoperability and help communication issues. We just need to look at the other end of the telescope on that.
Nicholas, can I just bring you in there and get your thoughts on that, and whether you're concerned about gaps widening between those that are able to transform and use technology more, or exploit emerging technologies more, and those allies that aren't?
Yes, so I view it as a very significant concern. NATO, especially the standardization office, as Brian alluded to, has done some great work. If anything, they could definitely use some more resources on that front, to say the least. But a great office that does a lot of, absolutely yeoman's work. With that said, there are huge interoperability issues still, not just in the alliance, and I alluded to this earlier, but in national militaries. I say this even on the US side, where you have Navy assets and able to communicate with Air Force assets. When you start extrapolating that to then outside national militaries, which already nominally do talk, it gets exponentially worse. If you look at any of the recent exercises, and this is all public record, where at the last minute they're having to drop off commercial walkie-talkies in some cases for units to be able to communicate with each other across national boundaries. A lot of good work's been done, but there's a long, long way to go before we ever get into the conversation of EDTs. And I think that there has to be, and pardon the colloquialism, but a bit of a come to Jesus moment where there needs to be investment by some of the larger NATO nations, saying, if we are really serious about being interoperable and standardizing all these things, it's great to have all these agreements. We need to actually fund some of the rollout of either commercial off-the-shelf solutions or FMS, or foreign military sales, at an even greater aperture, I should say, for these units to maintain this compatibility. Because when you talk about how things are going to work, where fifth gen fighters need to be able to communicate with fourth gen, and the new 6th gens that are being developed, they don't even talk to each other in national militaries. How are they going to share data in this greater situational awareness pictures? And we don't have an answer to that. There are a lot of great strategic frameworks. There are a lot of great ideas out there, but not a lot's actually been physically demonstrated and done. And that's not just a NATO problem, that's a national military problem. So I do think that there needs, in the short term, more needs to be done to help out the more developing nations. With that said, that also gets back to what I mentioned before on the macro sense, is in the longer term, for great power competition, we really do need to shift to a mindset of specialization. I've used the Estonia example before. There's also some great autonomous systems examples. So if we're a little more willing to share across this, rather than have every nation developing duplicative capabilities, that's going to go a long way. Because just, and one last alibi here, Deborah, to your earlier question you'd asked Barbara before she left, where are we behind? And I think that's a salient question, but it's also that presupposes our adversaries are just trying to mirror what we're doing. In fact, a lot of cases, they've used our 2-decade strategic pause on the global war on terror to develop things that mitigate our advantages, principally things like low-cost unmanned systems, but also, and swarming capabilities, but also we call A2AD, or anti-access area denial weapons, which at the end of the day, the cost equations for us don't close. If you have a $2.4 billion spy satellite that can be taken out by $60 million ASAT, or a $12 billion carrier, which can be disabled by roughly $100 million missiles, theoretically, that is a shift in how war is fought. And that gets back to that system of systems. And to Nick's point about there are always going to be platforms going to take a long time to develop. On one hand, I agree, but on the other, I don't think I think that's going to be less and less the case as we have to move away from these bespoke multi-mission platforms and get to that systems approach. We saw what the impact was in Nagorno-Karabakh, as well as some of the other conflicts in Georgia and Ukraine that were more nascent. That's going to affect all of our European allies and the United States. And if we're still focused on everyone developing their own national platforms, everyone having their own duplicative things, it's not going to be, any open conflict will not go well for us.
Thank you for that rather sobering thought. Nick, can I just come to you and ask you to elaborate a bit more? I didn't get a chance to ask Barbara about this before she had to leave, but after we had obviously Joe Biden coming to the UK earlier in the month, and this him and Boris Johnson signing this new Atlantic Charter and this US-UK tech pact as part of it. Can you just talk about what that's going to actually deliver, and is that how important is that, or is it sort of a bit of a feel good thing?
I think it is important. I mean, I think just picking up on some of the comments we've had before about where does your tech come from. The idea that basically you can acquire everything on your own and do it on your own is just so far from reality now. So I think that anything you can do to set the framework for that technological collaboration and actually technology protection as well as an issue we haven't really talked about, is a good thing. And I think that that's something certainly from the UK side that we've always very much valued, that collaboration with our US allies. It goes back a very long way. My son's a historian, so I'll resist the temptation to give you lots of historical examples. But there are lots of key technologies that we have done together over the years. So in a sense, that is really important. It's building on something that does already happen. I think a very interesting question about how that's going to work is actually in the commercial sector. How are our suppliers going to work together? It is actually very easy to work government to government or government to NATO. That's very easy. It is actually more difficult when you get to the point where actually you're going to build capabilities and deploy them and do that together. So I think that's why those sorts of frameworks are actually important. They reiterate something that we have always done. They spur us and challenge us to do better in that space. And also, I think they spur us to get a deeper collaboration going in some of those, much nearer capability fields. So I think that's, that is an important thing. And I think it's probably beyond just a feel-good thing, actually, if I could be a piece of old. My political lords and masters will look at me, and I'm sure my US colleagues will have the same and go, okay, then guys, what have you actually done with that, that political capital that we've expended coming together and moving out and all of those sorts of things. And there will be quite a lot of looking at priorities and collaboration opportunities and how we do that over the next sort of 6 months to a year.
Well, it's interesting sort of talking to officials and ministers, over the last year or so, when we had in the UK that whole debate about Huawei and 5G, and that feeling that the world's democracies perhaps had kind of dropped the ball a bit when it came to that emerging technology, and the fact that there wasn't an equivalent to what a Chinese company was offering that a country like the UK could immediately have. What is being done to address that in terms of developing emerging technologies, be it 5G, be it quantum computing, be it artificial intelligence? What is being done to ensure that that a market, an emerging market, isn't being monopolized by potentially a country like China that is viewed as a competitor by many, and a rival by others, and a threat by some? How is that? What's being done to mitigate that problem? Are democracies working together and collaborating in the field of technology and defense because they share the same value systems? Is that happening more, or is anything being done to make that happen?
So it's interesting you raise that point. I mean, there are various sort of technical agreements being discussed with our allies, and I'm a geek with a soldering iron, so sometimes things that are discussed surprise me. But one of the first pillars of the ones I've seen is actually about that common shared purpose and values. And that is actually, I think that is recognised quite widely across government, and that's what we have to do. It's also a pragmatic thing. I mean, if you look at the supply chains that we will all seek to exploit, they are very, very complicated and very, very interlinked. And and the idea that a nation can secure its supply chain in all sorts of places on its own without its allies, I think is in some areas is stretching it a little bit. So I think, and those discussions are being held. In terms of some more overt technology protection, the UK has just passed legislation to protect some of its high-tech companies from that technology going abroad or being unduly influenced. So I think that's quite an active thing in that space to protect our technologies and actually to develop them together.
Thank you. And Brian, could you just come in on that point? I mean, Nicholas earlier kind of made that interesting observation about how different allies use different technologies, when it comes to 5G, for example. What's NATO? Do you think there's a role for NATO in terms of saying where allies can and can't get their kit from, for example? I mean, obviously that's Turkey's kind of an issue, isn't it, at the moment, in terms of its missile defense systems that it chooses to buy. But could you just give a sense from your perspective of, do you think that there's a role to play? Does NATO have a role to play in maybe exposing vulnerabilities to supply chains and helping to raise awareness where there is risk?
Absolutely. NATO has a role to, first of all, act as a forum in which the nations can consult, share experience and be transparent to the extent they wish on their own assessments of supply chain vulnerabilities. And that has been done in appropriate groupings. NATO can provide briefings, my own team can provide briefings on our assessments of certain shortages of key materials. The rare earths is a good example, a well-known example of where we are able in appropriate groupings to share our assessments, but also what we as a science community can provide for the allies as advice in which they might be able to mitigate their dependencies on certain scarce materials through the use of alternatives, for example, or alternative designs. So these choices will be made by the nations, and that is right and proper, but NATO does provide a forum for consultation and coordination should any ally wish to raise these issues of concern, together through myself and my office of scientific advice back to the nations on these issues as well.
Thank you. And Nicholas, do you want to offer your thoughts on that issue, on sort of supply chain risk? And then I have another question for you as well. But you can have that
sounds
one first.
Good. I agree with pretty much everything Brian just had to say. In fact, I do believe NATO, and this would involve a more assertive NATO, has made a much bigger role to play as an organization and across its components as a coordinating function. So let's take the issue where we've been discussing around supply chain security. So a lot of time we just think, okay, it's about manufacturing. Brian also brought up another critical component, which is the raw material side, particularly REEs or rare earth elements, where China currently supplies roughly 90% of all REEs used in Europe. So that's obviously a huge concern. The other part where it's a little more nascent is around the finance side. So on one hand, yes, you need to bring manufacturing back. And I'll give a quick example of that I think is something NATO should look at. Japan, when they decided after a number of recent issues, they wanted to pull back supply chains from China. What they offered was not, you have to come back to Japan. They said, you just have to leave China. Go anywhere else, we'll give you incentives to do that to Japanese companies. We'd love for you to come to Japan, but if you choose to go to India, if you choose to go to the US, fine. And at the end of the day, we do need to bring some of that indigenous capability back from the manufacturing side. And we already talked about the rare earth side, but then there's also the finance side. So as we look, and as I've kind of mentioned a couple of times during this conversation, the importance of non-traditionals and venture-backed startups, one of the key advantages of the West, and this goes for Europe and the US, and the UK is actually fast gaining in this regard, is venture capital investment in dual-use technologies. And increasingly, we need to find better ways of illuminating those supply chains. So there is still a very significant issue of Western venture capital firms that have significant stakes by LPs or limited partners who are Chinese or come through Chinese state-owned companies, then through Hong Kong and then through another entity. And being able to illuminate those supply chains is something that's hard for the United States and the UK and France, but is dang near impossible if you're some of these smaller nations which don't have access to tools or capabilities. And NATO could really provide two, I think, foundational aspects of this for security, which is helping be a clearinghouse for who has been indeed looked at and vetted, and then at the same time, helping train these other nations on what to look for and providing both the scientific expertise to look at that, but also just the know-how from the venture side and the more, I guess, accounting and financial illumination. It's really critical here. It's not just about, hey, we need to be able to get the right manufacturing. It's we need to get the right raw materials and have unprecedented access to it, which we don't now, but also get the finance side right so we can really accelerate that. And that is really, I believe, one of the things that will contribute and drive, if NATO is to have its continued edge and the West, is the ability to access those unique sources of capital.
Thank you. And we're running short on time. So if you can give this next reply really brief, and then I'd like to get Brian and Nick to say one comment each as well. But you can think about the comment while Nicholas is answering this question. So Nicholas, the question for you is, you kind of brought up that important point about the private sector and how vital that is in terms of developing R&D basically in new technology. Like, what do governments, that transatlantic governments, need to do better to incentivize the private sector to innovate in support of national security priorities? And while you're thinking of an answer to that, for Brian and Nick, could you just say, after Nicholas has replied, just very quickly, 10 years from now, what will need to have happened for you to be satisfied that the alliance has met this challenge of emerging, changing technologies, changing landscapes, and the need to collaborate better? What will you want to see 10 years from now to show that that's actually happened? Anything tangible? Right, Nicholas, you first.
So there's two sides of this, and I'll try to be very brief. It's both attracting companies in the ecosystem and then also retaining them. And there are a whole range of tools, which I know we don't have time to get into here. But the biggest thing that governments and DODs tend to go into, or MODs, is let's find them money. Let's give them financing. And that's great. And that is a huge pillar of this. But it's also trying to incentivize that private capital to get involved too. There's a couple of unique programs I just want to quickly call out. First is the Air Force Ventures, or AFWorks, in the United States, which provides both really rapid contracts. They've cut their contracting time in half, but then also in certain cases will match dollar for dollar venture funding that company receives within 90 days of their contract award on either side. And that's non-dilutive equity, meaning the governments aren't taking a stake, but that's giving that company more runway. And that's allowing venture capitalists who normally didn't see a lot of returns in the defense or dual use space to put more money in, because they see, well, they've got a contract through the Air Force. My dollars are going to be matched, but I still maintain my position on the cap table. And so that makes it a more attractive area. And then for retention, this gets back to the valley of death. In the US and the UK as well, there's a long road between small contracts and big programs of record. And we need to find different financing and other tools to get them across that 4 to 5 years and hopefully close that up. The Netherlands has a great program for entrepreneurs at large, giving them tax holidays when they start a business for X number of years, both payroll and personal. So there's a lot more there, but I think those would be some really good steps initially.
Thank you so much. And Nick, to you first, if you can give me 10 years from now, what do you want to see to show that NATO Britain has stepped up to the challenge?
I think I'd just come back to that point about it's about speed of getting the capabilities you want. Now, actually, I can look across NATO and the nations. We have done that really quickly when we had to, but we somehow haven't quite made that our normal way of operating. So I think in 10 years' time, if I can match the speed of the operational, insertion of technology and make that our core business, and if I can actually look across, the Atlantic and go, I can access all of that technology base, and I have to be able to do it quick. Those would be the key things for me.
Thank you. And Brian, just a final word from you, please.
Thank you very much indeed. In 10 years' time, I would like to see three things. The first is the NATO Science and Technology Programme of Work continuing to deliver what the nations want it to deliver. In response to the We Must Do More, the collaborative programme of work has increased by 50% over the last 6 years. So the nations are doing more, and I would like to see the nations driving that in the way that they wish to see it. The second point we've not really touched on, and that is I want to see NATO helping the nations in recruiting and retaining young scientists. They're going to be our lifeblood from 10 years on through to the future. NATO is already doing a lot through the Science and Technology Organization. I'd like to see more of that so that we are helping the nations build their stock of new blood, new scientists to maintain the technological edge. The third thing I'd like to do, coming back to the civil sector, is I hope that the work we are doing now to invest in our understanding of the next generation of emerging and disruptive technologies will be fruitful, so that when our leaders meet in 10 years' time and they say technology X is going to be the next emerging and disruptive technology, the NATO Science and Technology Organization can say that they are already on the case. They understand that technology and the implications. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you so much to all of you for giving such a fascinating insight into an area that's clearly going to be underpinning all of our lives and ensuring our security in the years ahead. So thank you.